Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Comes the Dawn by Irina Shapiro, narrated by Eva Kaminsky. Prologue. Comes the Dawn. After a while, you learn the subtle difference between holding a hand and chaining a soul. And you learn that love doesn't mean leaning, and company doesn't mean security. And you begin to learn that kisses aren't contracts, and presents aren't promises. And you begin to accept your defeats, with your head up and your eyes open, with the grace of a woman, not the grief of a child. And you learn to build all your roads on today, because tomorrow's ground is too uncertain for plans, and futures have a way of falling down in mid-flight. After a while you learn but even sunshine burns if you get too much. So you plant your own garden and decorate your own soul, instead of waiting for someone to bring you flowers. And you learn that you really can endure, that you really are strong, and you really do have worth. And you learn and learn. With every goodbye you learn. Author unknown. April 1689. London, England. Chapter 1. Feeble moonlight streamed through the narrow window of the cell, casting a silvery pall onto the stone floor. The flame of a single candle threw shifting shadows onto the walls, giving off barely enough light to see by, the tiny orange orb the only warmth in the chill of the prison. The night outside was utterly still, as if even the wind was too wary to blow. But the air inside the cell crackled with tension, an electric current coursing between the two men facing each other across the small space, both braced for a confrontation. Hugo studied Max's features. He hadn't seen Max in several years, not since the showdown in the Paris mine when Max had kidnapped Neve and Valentine, and lured Hugo to what he hoped was his own execution. Things didn't go according to plan, at least not for Max. But Hugo had to admit that on some level, he was relieved that he hadn't killed Max that day, since he didn't want the man's death on his conscience. But oh, how he wished never to lay eyes on him again. How was it possible for a man he barely knew to harbour such hatred against him and pursue him across time and space? Max hadn't changed much physically, but something had shifted in his demeanour. There was a watchfulness that hadn't been there before, a strange sort of resignation almost, which left Hugo wary and confused. Max's presence in Hugo's cell was inexplicable, but then again, most things Max had done since their unfortunate meeting years ago in the 21st century had been beyond comprehension. Max was driven by a madness which had been nearly impossible to detect behind his urbane exterior, his need to possess Neve bordering on obsession. Was this why he was here now? To gloat over Hugo's helplessness, as he once again made a play for his family? Hugo balled his hands into fists, ready to beat the man to a pulp. But he sensed no outward hostility from the other man, just a sense of expectation. So he took a step back and forced himself to relax. "Have you come to finish me off?" Hugo asked calmly. "Or just to gloat?" "Neither, actually," Max replied, holding up both hands to show Hugo that he held no concealed weapon. His expression was strangely bland, which irritated Hugo even further. "Then why are you here?" "I had to speak to you. It's rather important." "Well, say your piece then," Hugo said with a shrug. "I can't imagine what we have to say to each other at this juncture." "Hugo, I've wronged you, and I wish to make amends," Max began, but was interrupted by Hugo's harsh laugh. This really was too much. "You must be joking," Hugo spat out. "I'd like you to leave now," Hugo, please, hear me out. Max spread his hands in a gesture of peace, but Hugo was in no mood to listen. The man had unimaginable gall. Perhaps Hugo would be more inclined to listen if they were on even terms, but Hugo's position of helplessness infuriated him. He was locked up, unarmed and entirely without resources, unable to defend himself or his family. "Go away, Max," Hugo growled, suddenly furious. "You've tried to kill me twice. You've kidnapped my wife and child. And now that I am finally where you want me to be, you wish to make amends. I find that difficult to believe. Just know this. If you do anything to harm Neve or my children, I will haunt you from beyond the grave." Hugo winced at the absurdity of this ludicrous statement. Was that the only thing left to him? Making empty threats? "Will you just shut up and listen?" Max retorted, his patience at an end. "I realize you're angry, and you have every right to be. But I've had a lot of time to think, Hugo. I've always imagined myself to be special. I ridiculed the very notion of God, believing myself to be too superior to need such an obvious delusion. Faith was for those who were less fortunate than I, for those who needed a higher being to pander to, a fairy tale to make their pitiful lives more bearable. I took everything for granted, and thought that my money and position could pave the way for anything I wanted. And it had, until I met your charming wife," he added sarcastically. "Coming to this God-forsaken century made me realize that I am nothing, and it's a painful truth to face up to. I am a coward, a bully, and a man no one loves. I have nothing and no one to go back to. The only person who ever loved me was my mother, and even if she is still alive, she won't be for much longer." "What's your point?" Hugo asked, still annoyed, but also mildly curious. This wasn't the overly confident, pompous man he'd met before, who wore his superiority like a shield. This man appeared more human, more vulnerable. Unless this was all an act designed to win Hugo's trust before striking the fatal blow. "My point is that I want my life to count for something," Max explained patiently. "You are the better man, Hugo. You always had been. Maybe that's why the woman I fancied myself in love with gave up everything to follow you to the past. She knew right away that you were the one who deserved her love, not I. She saw something in you that she knew I lacked. Moral fibre, honour, strength of character. All the things women yearn for but rarely find." "That's very touching, Max, and I applaud your newly found humility. But I don't see what you are getting at," Hugo replied. He was thoroughly confused, but hated to admit it. Max was up to something, but damn if he knew what that was, and he hated the feeling of trying to maintain his equilibrium on shifting sand. Max removed his cloak and shoved it at Hugo. "I want you to put this on and walk out. Go back to your family and keep them safe." "Are you mad?" Hugo was growing angry again, his patience growing thin. This was all a trick, the purpose of which he had yet to work out. Max was as cunning as ever. "No, I am not. I think I am truly sane for the first time in my life. Hugo, go back to the 21st century. Take over my life. Be Lord Everlys." Hugo stared at Max, whose eyes glowed with an inner light Hugo found difficult to reconcile with the old Max. He seemed to be overcome with fervour, like a martyr offering to die for his convictions. He'd spoken of God earlier. Perhaps he'd found the solace of religion, but that still didn't explain this largesse. "Even if I accepted, which I won't, how could I get away with it?" Hugo asked, a tiny pinprick of hope growing somewhere in his soul. He could never take Max up on his offer. But there was something else he could do. An idea was taking root in his mind, the pinprick now growing bigger and brighter. People believe what they want to believe. If you say you are Maximilian Everlys, people will believe you, even if deep down they have their doubts. There are only 3 people who can disprove the claim: my mother, my physician, and my dentist. I have never been fingerprinted, and the doctors are bound by laws of confidentiality. They cannot reveal any information unless subpoenaed by the courts. Only my mother would know for sure. I am sorry, Max, but your mother is gone, Hugo said softly. We've had a visit from Simon a few months back. You've met Simon? He knows about the passage. Max gasped, his gaze suddenly more alert. Hugo could see a momentary flash of pain behind the eyes. Max had obviously cared for Simon, although Hugo wasn't sure if he realized that the housekeeper's brat he'd lorded it over was really his half-brother. It would seem so. He escaped from his own wedding. Max suddenly chuckled, his face alight with amusement. That's Simon, all right. He went back, did he? Good. This is no place for him. Anyway, Hugo, this is your only chance. I am willing to give it to you. Take it before I change my mind. Max, you are offering to die in my place, Hugo retorted. I must admit that I am somewhat taken aback by your pangs of conscience at this late stage. But you don't understand what you're suggesting. This is not a game. Don't talk to me of games, Hugo. I am the one who'd been sent down to a sugar plantation. I still have marks on my back as a souvenir of the flogging I received. And I'd agreed to be buried alive and ingested pufferfish poison to facilitate my escape. I know this isn't a game, but having gone through all that to save my life, once safe, I realize that my life is actually quite worthless. I've thought this through. This is absurd. I won't do it. Hugo hissed, as the muffled sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. The guard was coming back. Yes, you will. You will do it for Neve, because she doesn't deserve to be a widow. I have never known love like that, Hugo. If I had a woman who loved me as much as Neve loves you, I would do anything to stay alive. I would sacrifice anything, including a man who wronged you. What is it you're really after, Max? Max hung his head for a moment before answering, his breathing laboured. Redemption. I want redemption. Hugo opened his mouth to reply when they heard the jangle of keys outside the door. Their eyes met as Max pushed the cloak into Hugo's hands. Go. I'll be back in 3 days, Max. I need to see to my family, and try to figure out what evidence the Crown has on me. But I will be back. You have my word. I'm not prepared to let you sacrifice your life for me. That's my decision to make, Max replied, as he sat down on the cot. No, it isn't. Just go. Hugo threw on the cloak, pulled the hood up over his head, and followed the guard out the door, his heart thumping painfully against his ribs. The corridors were illuminated by the faint light coming from several sconces, the flames of the torches flickering and casting eerie shadows onto the walls. This part of the tower wasn't beneath ground, but it felt like a tomb, the inmates buried alive, their chances of regaining freedom practically non-existent. The next time most of them walked out of this prison would be to face their executioner. Some received a pardon, but Hugo wouldn't be one of them. Not this time. His insides twisted with guilt, but he forced himself to walk on, his eyes glued to the stone floor until he was outside in the fresh April air, walking through the gates and out to freedom. Max's horse was tethered outside, just as he said, but Hugo chose not to ride. He led the animal by the reins, needing some time to walk and come to terms with what had just occurred. He still doubted Max's motives, Could a person truly have such a drastic change of heart? Even if Max were repentant, Hugo couldn't accept his sacrifice. What kind of man would that make him? He supposed many would, especially given their past history. But this just wasn't right. To kill Max during an altercation would have been honourable. To simply condemn him to death wasn't. But Max had given Hugo a welcome reprieve, an opportunity to see Neve and try to discredit the evidence against him. He would return in 3 days as promised and set Max free, perhaps to return home to the 21st century. Hugo smiled bitterly as he imagined himself as Lord Everlys in that distant future. How sweet it would be. The streets were deserted and nearly pitch dark. The overhanging top floors of Tudor houses that stood shoulder to shoulder, like a line of soldiers, casting the street of Blackfriars into deep shadow. Narrow alleyways gaped like open mouths, their dank breath stinking of refuse and rotten vegetables. Only the light of the moon lit Hugo's way, as he walked in the direction of the Strand. The night was still, but a slight tang of the Thames hovered in the air, bringing with it the smell of wet mud, which couldn't overpower the scent of new grass and flowers that grew stronger as Hugo left Blackfriars behind. What was it about spring that made a man so acutely aware of his desire to live? Somehow, dying in the dead of winter never seemed as devastating as it did when the world was bursting with life, the cold and dark of winter replaced at last by sunlight and colour. Hugo hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door of Brad's house. He could see a narrow chink of light glowing between the shutters on the ground floor. Someone was still awake, and he hoped it was Archie. He was desperate to see Neve, but talking the situation over with Archie would help him put things in perspective, and maybe come up with a feasible plan of action before facing his distraught wife. He needed to reassure her, not inform her that he would be going back to the tower in 3 days' time, and this might be their last goodbye. Hugo took a deep breath and knocked softly on the door. He felt momentary relief when he heard Archie's heavy footsteps, but the relief was quickly replaced by surprise, as Neve, Francis, Brad, and Jem filled into the foyer, all talking over each other, their faces alight with joy at seeing him. "Hugo!" Neve flew into his arms, her face tear-stained and wan, but her eyes shining with happiness. "Did they let you go? Was it all a terrible mistake?" She looked so hopeful, so relieved, that Hugo's throat tightened with regret. "No, it wasn't, love. I'll explain later," he mumbled, loath to tell Neve that he was still under arrest and would have to go back. Hugo was spared further questions when Jem flew at him and wrapped his arms around his middle. "Jem, what are you doing here? Is your father with you? Did you come for the coronation?" Hugo's heart swelled with joy at the sight of the boy. He'd missed him so much since his father took Jem to live with him. Jem wasn't Hugo's son, but he would always be his first child, the first person who truly needed him and gave him unconditional love. Losing Jem had been painful for them all, but most of all for Hugo, since he'd had no choice in the matter. To insist on keeping Jem would be to deny him a future he deserved. But Nick Marsden, although a good friend and honourable man, could never love the boy as Hugo did. Jem shook his head against Hugo's chest, but made no reply. Hugo bent down and kissed the top of Jem's head, the curls tickling his nose. Last time he held Jem, his head reached just above Hugo's waist. He was a child no longer. He was 13 now, practically a man. Hugo held him at arm's length, studying his face. There was just a shadow of fuzz on his upper lip, and he'd grown at least a foot since they said goodbye in Paris. Jem's voice was still that of a boy. But it wouldn't be long before it changed, and all traces of the child were gone forever.
"I'll deal with you later,"
Hugo said softly.
"I'm happy to see you, Jemmy."
"Hugo, there have been some developments," Brad said quietly, as they all trooped into the parlour. Francis went to get some refreshments from the kitchen, while everyone took a seat, eager to hear what Hugo had to say. He wasn't even sure where to begin. To try to explain Max's visit defeated even his imagination. So he turned to Brad.
"What's happened, Brad?"
"Someone made an accusation against Neve. An ecclesiastical committee is already in Cranley, ready to arrest her as soon as she returns. I've come to warn her." Hugo stared at Brad, his mouth open in shock. An accusation of witchcraft? He expelled his breath and took a seat by the hearth, suddenly exhausted. They'd returned to England less than 4 months ago, and already their peaceful existence in Rouen was nothing but a distant memory. Would they never be able to just live their lives without the constant threat of danger? Hugo waited until Francis handed around cups of ale and set down some bread and cheese on the sideboard. He gulped down his ale and held out his cup for a refill. He was hungry, but food would have to wait. 5 pairs of eyes were boring into him, waiting for an explanation and some reassurance that Neve wouldn't have to face trial.
"Right,"
Hugo began.
"I have been granted a 3-day reprieve, the reasons for which I am still trying to understand."
"A reprieve from the tower?" Archie asked, his eyes round with incredulity.
"In a manner of speaking. I must use this time to discover what evidence the Crown has against me, and try to discredit it. We also have to figure out how to deal with this baseless accusation against Neve," he added.
Hugo still couldn't believe this was real. Who would make such an accusation at this stage? And why? "Neve must remain in London," Brad chimed in. "She will be taken as soon as she returns." "I have to go back to the children," Neve protested. "I can't stay away indefinitely. There's nothing the committee can do to me. There's no proof of anything."
"Proof is not always necessary," Hugo replied, reminding Neve of her time in Newgate. "Proof can be fabricated, as we all know."
Neve shook her head stubbornly. "I must go back, Hugo. I must be with the children." Hugo looked at the expectant faces. They assumed he had a plan, and one was forming in his mind, but he needed a little time to finesse the details.
"Brad, I'd like you to escort Neve and Francis back to Surrey. Archie, I need you to remain in London, and Jem, go with Lady Everlys. Brad, you can send a message to me with Jem. It's not safe for me to remain here, so I'll be at the Black Dog in Blackfriars. Now, I need a few minutes with Archie, if you don't mind."
Hugo pulled Neve into his arms as everyone began to file out of the parlour. There was so much he wanted to say to her, but the words simply wouldn't come. So they just stood together, her head on his shoulder, his chin resting on her golden curls. Neve finally broke the embrace and looked up at him. "Is this it, Hugo? Is this the end?" He could hear the fear in her voice, but couldn't bear to lie to her.
"I don't know, but I will do everything in my power to keep you and the children safe."
"And will you keep yourself safe as well?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "How did you get out?"
"I left Max in my place,"
Hugo replied with a smile. "That's not even remotely funny."
"No, it's not. But it happens to be true. I'll explain when I come up. I didn't want to say anything in front of everyone. Go get ready for bed. I'll join you presently."
Hugo planted a lingering kiss on Neve's lips before finally releasing her.
"Go," he whispered.
Archie closed the door behind Neve and turned to Hugo, his face filled with determination.
"What's the plan?" he asked without preamble. "What would you have me do?" "Go home," Hugo replied, as he reached for some bread and cheese. "Home?" "Go back to Cranley, but keep your presence a secret. You can stay with your father. His farm is remote enough that no one will know you're there. Find out who made the accusation against Neve and what evidence they have." Hugo clarified as he chewed slowly. His mind was going in circles, but he needed to organize his thoughts and come up with a viable plan. He pushed his plate aside, no longer hungry. "There are 3 reasons why someone would make an accusation of witchcraft," Hugo theorized, as he began pacing in front of the hearth, something he frequently did while formulating an idea. 1. The accusation was made by a religious zealot who sees evil behind every bush. 2. Neve is somehow a threat, and this would get her out of the way. And 3. This is done out of revenge, either against Neve or myself. Once we know what we are dealing with, we'll decide on a course of action." "What course of action did you have in mind?" Archie asked, still considering the 3 choices. "A zealot would be the hardest to dissuade. But if this is, in fact, a case of revenge or jealousy, there is always a financial angle to pursue. Everyone can be bought at the right price. If the accuser can be paid not to testify, the case would very quickly fall apart, and Neve would be safe from persecution." "I can't think of any religious fanatics in Cranley, can you?" Archie asked, his brow furrowed. "No. I wager this has nothing to do with witchcraft at all," Hugo mused, as he helped himself to another cup of ale. "Just make sure that Neve has nothing to do with your investigation. The committee must not learn of your efforts on Neve's behalf. The accuser must withdraw their accusation without any hint of interference. Understand?" "Of course," Archie replied. "And what will you do in the meantime?" "I'll start by having a friendly chat with Henry Fitzroy," Hugo replied, his voice suddenly laced with anger. "He's the only person who could have betrayed me, and like myself, he has much to lose. Henry is playing both sides, pandering to his cousin Mary, while still maintaining his loyalty to his uncle, Mary's father, James II. At this stage, he believes an armed invasion by James is a real possibility, and must convince James of his loyalty, should James reclaim the throne. Of course, Hugo knew this wouldn't happen, and William and Mary would rule for years to come. But Henry Fitzroy, illegitimate son of Charles II, nephew to James II, and cousin to Queen Mary, did not. Revealing his double-dealing to Mary, who was no doubt already suspicious, being the clever political consort to her husband for years, would destroy any credibility Henry had at court, and possibly force Mary's hand in having Henry incarcerated for treason. Hugo had no wish to see Henry arrested, but he would blackmail him if it came to that. "Watch yourself," Archie advised unnecessarily. "He's a duplicitous bastard." "That he is," Hugo replied. "But everyone has a weak spot, and I know Henry's." "Get some rest, Archie," Hugo said, as he turned toward the door. "This might be my last night with my wife," he said sadly. "I want to make sure it's memorable for us both." Chapter 2. His Majesty, King William III, sank into a comfortable chair in front of the hearth and stretched his booted feet out to the fire, enjoying the warmth. He'd been attending to royal duties since rising at dawn, and his back ached from sitting on the throne, his back erect and shoulders rigid, as he saw petitioner after petitioner, followed by a session with his advisers, and a never-ending supper, which left his bowels growling with indigestion. The king's steward, Wilf, placed a cup of hot milk at his master's side, and retired discreetly to the corner to await further instructions, his day not over until William was tucked into bed. William reached for the cup of milk and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?